Civil liberties are increasingly in the headlines in Florida, from book bans to free speech in the classroom. At the moment, the Florida branch of the American Civil Liberties Union is welcoming a new executive director, and she joins me now. Welcome, Bacardi Jackson.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So, you have an interesting personal backstory, and I want to get to that. But first, define for us, for people who don't know, what are civil liberties and what's threatening them in Florida as you see it?
Civil liberties are the rights that are guaranteed by our Constitution, and the ACLU is the organization that protects civil liberties and protects our Constitution. So, critically important that we all pay attention to the things that are happening in this state. And some of the threats that we are seeing are things that you just mentioned, such as book bans, censorship in our educational institutions. We are seeing an attack on women's rights to control their own bodies. We are seeing attacks on immigrants, attacks on LGBTQ people. So there are lots of things that have been happening on the front lines of the work that we have to do to protect civil liberties in Florida.
And how much of the national debate of civil liberties and the work of the ACLU nationally, how much of that oxygen is being drawn into Florida right now in these debates? It just seems like we're making headlines nationally almost every other week.
It is interesting because there are so many eyes on Florida, and in part because Florida is a state where we have seen lots of bad ideas being experimented here. I think because there has been a lock on at the executive, judicial, and the legislative branches in terms of people who have been attacking civil liberties. People are really aware of the fact that many things can brew here that then spread across the nation. And so we have certainly had much help from our national office in terms of some of the litigation that we have had to bring in order to protect civil liberties. We have had other affiliates around the country who have said, how can we come and help? And in fact, we're having some of those conversations right now as it relates to the work that's happening on reproductive justice and freedom.
And you, of course, are a former attorney. I would guess that some of the legal battles that you're fighting here become templates when those same challenges are emerging in other states.
Absolutely. Yes, we certainly are able to share out with others, especially when you're talking about federal laws that are being violated and rights that are being attacked across the spectrum.
I want to ask you about a specific issue that's been emerging just in the last couple of days in terms of a state agency that's created a website page related to Amendment 4. That's the abortion amendment that would legalize abortion up to viability in the state. It's the Agency for Healthcare Administration. It's essentially kind of a health department at the state level,
Right.
and they have weighed in on Amendment 4. The webpage is titled Florida is Protecting Life, and it says, Florida is protecting life. Don't let the fear mongers lie to you. Florida law protects women, and Amendment 4 threatens women's safety. And there's been some concerns about the state using a state platform to effectively weigh in on this amendment. What's your take on that?
This is one of the most disturbing things I have seen that our government has recently done. Our government is a body that exists for the people, by the people. It's supposed to serve the people. It is not supposed to be a political partisan entity that puts its thumb on the scale of political debates and discussions. Certainly, there is a debate. Reasonable minds can disagree about what people, what the right policy decision may be, but that's a political debate. That's a political debate that's happening right now, and there are ways for that political process to happen that's fair, which is if you have a position, you can raise money for that position, you can garner support for it, and you go to the ballot box. And the people of Florida, this is a citizen-led initiative, Amendment 4, to put on the ballot the question of whether or not pregnant people should have the ability to have access to abortions. Right now, we have a near total ban that has very limited, if any, real exceptions for even rape, incest, or the health and life of a woman. And so we are, working behind a coalition that has brought this citizen led initiative. And the government's role is not to come in and put its finger on the scale for that. The government's role is to, especially a health agency, is to weigh on health related issues that affect all people and not talk about political issues. And so when you have this kind of interference, it is deeply, deeply disturbing because taxpayer money is being used to fund that.
This is the agency that regulates abortion clinics in the state of Florida. Is it legal to use a taxpayer-funded site with a for political messaging?
There is a statute that prohibits the use of state resources for political messaging. This is not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to be able to use taxpayer dollars for campaigning, and that is exactly what this website represents, and that's a problem.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Bacardi Jackson. She is the new executive director of the ACLU of Florida, and we are taking your calls and questions. You can reach us at 904-549-2937 on air, or you can email comments or questions to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. I want to ask you on a different matter, but sort of related. It's also an Amendment 4 issue. Um, Recently, some state law enforcement officials have been going to the homes of people who've signed a petition supporting getting Amendment 4 on the ballot. Is the ACLU involved in that issue at all?
Yes, we have been getting reports from people who have been involved in collecting signatures or people who have signed a petition. And we were very much involved in the campaign to collect signatures and to get the amendment on the ballot. We are one of the members of the Floridians Protecting Freedom Coalition that has brought this amendment to the ballot. And so you can imagine the incredible just just the shock of hearing that people who have exercised their constitutional right to participate in our government by signing a petition are being faced with officers showing up at their doorstep. This is the kind of intimidation tactic you would expect to see in an authoritarian regime, not in America, not in a democracy, not in a place where our most valued freedoms include the ability to speak truth to power, the ability to speak it without reprisal from our government. And so I am still in shock that this has been happening, and it is something that is absolutely unacceptable, and we are exploring options right now.
And our understanding, though, is that the state is saying they're looking at signatures that were maybe invalid or fraudulent somehow, that they're looking into whether they were faked signatures.
Let me tell you, we when the ballot collection happened, the organization not only met the requirements of getting the requisite number of signatures, but got 100,000 more than they needed to get. These signatures were already validated by the supervisors of elections. We paid for that process to make sure it was happening. The kinds of protections that were put in place throughout the whole process to make sure all of those signatures were valid has been robust. And to now see a couple of months before the election, almost a year after people signed these petitions, for the government to come in and use its weight of authority, its fear tactics to try to intimidate people is not only offensive to this particular issue and for the people who've worked so hard to make sure people can weigh in on this issue, it's offensive to anybody who loves democracy.
We've got an email from Ross. He says, where does the Florida ACLU stand on laws restricting hate speech? Has the organization that, out of principle, sued to protect the free speech rights of a Klansman lost its way? He's wanting to know, would the ACLU still side with Brandenburg, that's the Klan case, if it occurred today?
You know, there's a lot of discussion that has happened internally in the ACLU, and it's an organization that is constantly evolving. We certainly are not a one party or partisan organization. We're not an organization that just represents the people who are easy to represent. We represent the Constitution. And if anyone's rights are being violated, we certainly will look into stepping into protecting those rights. Obviously, there are places where you have to weigh, does someone else's rights hurt someone else? And I think we are now having really nuanced conversations about that. And where you might see one right also cause harm, there is certainly a stepping back to weigh and carefully consider, is that something we need to step into? But on the other hand, we will step in. We just recently represented the NRA, who we vehemently disagree with. We are often on the other side of the NRA, but we represented them in a case in New York where we saw a government agent using the power of the government to stop them from having the kinds of things that they should be able to have access to, like financial resources. And so we understand that any time you see government invasion into people's rights, that can be turned at any moment on any of us. And so you have to have a body that is principled, that will protect those rights no matter who is the plaintiff.
We've got a call from Ed in Orange Park. Good morning, Ed. Go ahead.
Good morning. Well, I believe the American people are really, most of us are rather reasonable. They don't like extremes in anything.
Mhm.
You have in the abortion situation, you have two extremes. You have the extreme on the pro-life, let's say, who have the one no abortion for any circumstances at all, except for perhaps the life of the mother, and that's about the only exception. That's the super extreme pro-life. And you have the pro-choice or pro-abortion who wants literally no limit up to the moment of birth, the 9 months, for any reason. There's no limitation. Most people don't agree with those extremes. The question is, can you name any Republican in elected office who is for the super extreme version I just gave of the pro-life? And can you name any Democrat, including Harris or any of the politicians who are in the Democrat Party, who have any qualms about limiting abortions or the choice all the way to the end of term? I think the extremist seems to be more on the Democrat, and most people, I think, are more reasonable than that.
You know,
Thanks, Ed.
oh, thank you. Again, we don't represent any parties and we aren't standing with any political parties, but I can tell you that there is certainly a movement in this country where people have been and stood for the proposition of eliminating abortion access altogether. We have certainly seen that being pushed out as a clear agenda item. Certainly, former President Donald Trump. Um, his goal was to stack the Supreme Court with people who would overturn Roe v. Wade. I do not know anyone that I have ever heard or met in my entire life who has ever believed that you can have an abortion up to and through birth or after birth, as I think was suggested in the debate last night. I have never, ever heard anyone express that. We existed under Roe v. Wade for decades. I mean, many, many decades with the concept of viability. And that is a concept that a child could live outside of the womb. And so without question, I have never ever seen anyone suggest that abortions should go up into birth. So I'm not aware of anyone articulating that extreme or anyone holding that position. And that's certainly not the position of Amendment 4.
I mean, Amendment 4 allows for abortion up to the point of viability, but it does have language that says, if there is a decision made by a doctor, a physician, someone who's advising a woman medically, that could go beyond that. And it doesn't spell out a specific time frame or limit.
Right, and the reason for that is none of the rest of us are experts about that, and we believe that the decision, and it's a very difficult decision that pregnant people are put in a position to make, as to whether or not to have an abortion, is a decision that should be made by experts, by medical experts, by people who know if there is something that can harm life. If you are for life, you should be for the life of the mother of the child as well. And if there is a possibility that a pregnancy could harm that life, that should be concerning. And so we don't believe that is a decision that government should make. And the ban that exists right now is the government making that decision. And it cuts out the pregnant person. It cuts out the doctor and the medical expert to make that decision.
We've got a call from Jason in San Marco. Good morning, Jason. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I'm in my car driving. I hope you can hear me. What a fantastic in-studio guest. She's intelligent and she's articulate, and I would like to say that is the opposite of our governor. I want to point out the irony of driving into Florida from Georgia, where you see "Welcome to the Free State of Florida" signs. That is a sick and twisted way of looking at things here. And I also want to say that if you're a gun owner in Florida, the Republicans will bend over backwards to do anything you want. But if you're a pregnant woman, they literally will abandon you, or they'll take a truck, run over you, and then back up. It is sad. I truly hope, as a white male, that the women of this country stand up for their rights and turn this tide of tyranny away, reject people like Rick Scott, and make the right decision when this election comes up. Thank you for taking my call.
Thanks, Jason. I want to ask you, the ACLU, as you say, is designed to be nonpartisan, is by its posture nonpartisan. Is that getting harder in the current climate?
You know, I don't think so. What's really interesting, well, one of the things that has been interesting to me, and before I joined the ACLU, I was with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I spent quite a bit of time in Tallahassee. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is that I have witnessed and been part of conversations with Republicans who have come up and said they agree with the position that I was advocating for, but did not feel they had the freedom to say that and could not say it, and encouraged me to continue fighting for the position. And it is a sad day to me that whatever party you're in, you don't feel you have the freedom to believe and say out loud your principles because partisan politics gets in the way of that. So I think we should really be questioning and looking at what are the tactics that people are using right now. Whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Independent, you should not be afraid to stand up and say what you principally believe or to stand up for the law that you know is right. And so that's what's very disturbing to me right now.
Although I think to be fair, both parties have a long and rich history of kind of whipping their folk into line and not necessarily allowing for people to speak out individually and wanting them to tote the party line.
Certainly there are talking points, and certainly there are, and I actually at one point in my life worked on the Hill in Congress. Certainly I have seen both parties actively give people talking points, state their expectations. That's why you have what's literally called a party whip, to whip people into voting for certain positions. But what I have seen here has been a different kind of thing. What concerns me now is there's a real fear. Sometimes I have heard people express a fear for their actual safety, a fear of, not just their own political position going away. Like, certainly, if you step out of line with a party, you may not get funding from that party and you may lose your election. That's one kind of fear. But the kind of fear that says we're going to come after you and personally excoriate you, and we're going to bring charges against you, or we're going to come for your family. Like, these are the kinds of things we are seeing right now. And that deeply, deeply disturbs me. That's not the nation I expect America to be. That's not the kind of democracy I want to see my children inherit.
We've got a call from Tim in Orange Park. Good morning, Tim. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you folks today?
Great.
Terrific.
Good, good. So it seems that there's a misunderstanding. Pro-life people, not all of them, but many of them think that, once the kid is born, then that's the end of it. That seems to me to be pro-birth. Pro-life, life starts at the beginning, after birth, and then, children have to be taken care of, schooled, medical, dental, clothes, bed. And so, if you're pro-life, are you willing to pay the extra taxes in order to make all that happen, to make sure that children are brought up properly? And that's about the size of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tim. Of course, that's always been a talking point. I think that, there maybe isn't enough attention paid to what happens after birth.
I can't thank this caller enough for that comment, because one of the things that strikes me as incredibly ironic is just this past summer, our governor declined funding from the federal government to feed children. Um, I can't even imagine what could go through someone's head to say,
You're talking the summer lunch
the
program.
summer lunch program, to say we will not take this funding in order to feed children who are here, whose lives do matter. We are also in a state where we have removed the ability of having a unanimous jury verdict to decide whether people should be put to death. So yes, when you are talking about the value of life, my hope is that people will be consistent about that, and that if you truly do value that, we value it when it is here in all of its forms, in all of the ways and representations that it show up, no matter partisan, no matter what your gender, your identity, your race, your economic status, all of the lives that are here are very, very valuable.
I just briefly want to ask you about something that came up out of the debate last night. The New York Times called it, quote, the wildest sounding attack line that was basically true. And what they were talking about was when Mr. Trump was quoting Kamala Harris saying that she wants to do transgender operations on illegal aliens that are in prison. That's actually in response to a 2019 questionnaire from the ACLU to Kamala Harris, in which they asked whether she would support medical treatment for detained migrants who were receiving gender affirming care? And she said yes. And so that's actually kind of thrust your organization a little bit into the headlines almost overnight. What can you tell us about that?
That precedes my time, so I'm not super versed in it, but I can say that I have been involved in matters looking at the kinds of medical care we provide to people who are incarcerated and detained. And again, these are decisions that should be made by medical professionals. If someone determines that it is a medical necessity for someone who is suffering gender dysphoria to have medical treatment for that, that I trust the medical provider. I don't trust the government to make that decision. It's not a decision that should be based on somebody's religious beliefs or somebody's political leanings. It is a decision that is a serious decision that should be made in concert with a medical provider. And I trust that. And so I think just by virtue of people being incarcerated or detained does not mean that they should have access to necessary medical treatment cut off.
Bacardi Jackson, it's great talking to you. I hope that we are able to have you back in the coming months as you get your legs under you as the new executive director and continue your work. But we appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Oh, it was so wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be on the show, and thank you to your guest who called in.
100%.